Hello and welcome to Washington in Focus Daily. I'm Tim Clauser. Tonight, we're taking a closer look at three issues mounting in Washington state: Seattle's economic future, the role of the state Supreme Court, and what global events could mean for your wallet at the gas pump. Seattle leaders continue to debate how to attract employers, fill empty office space, and reverse concerns about the city's business climate. As city officials have faced budget challenges, some business advocates argue the focus should shift away from new taxes and toward policies that encourage investment and job growth. We'll also hear from a candidate running for a seat on the Washington Supreme Court about judicial independence, constitutional interpretation, and how voters should think about the balance between precedent and accountability. And later, we'll examine why Washington drivers continue to pay some of the highest gas prices in the nation and how tensions in the Middle East, along with state-specific policies, could influence prices in the months ahead. But first, we begin with Seattle's business climate. Downtown Seattle Association President and CEO John Scholes says Seattle's long-term success depends on growing its tax base by attracting more businesses, rather than increasing taxes on the companies already here.
No new taxes. I think we need to take a careful look at, what are these taxes going to? What have they produced? And I think we need to be much more embracing of incentives to attract investment and to take a longer term view. The city may have to give up some tax revenue on the front end to attract some investment that over time will have a long-term significant payback for the public sector. And we need to have that kind of attitude. And so incentives around, hey, if you locate jobs in Seattle, if you're signing a big lease, we're going to give you a break on B&O tax and the payroll tax. If you're a retailer or a restaurant that's coming in to activate a ground floor, we're going to do the same. We're going to make it easy for you to get a permit. We're going to hold you harmless on your B&O for some period of time. Like, we should be looking at those types of things because that's how we grow and strengthen the tax base for the long term. We do not believe, and I said it at the event, and I've said it since, that Seattle needs more business taxes. We need more businesses in Seattle paying taxes. And I think the city's attitude of how do we grow the tax base has been principally focused on extracting more and more from a small group of employers that are here. And that's not a long-term sustainable strategy. And I think we're starting to see those facts being borne out by the city's own revenue projections, which are lower than they have been for the payroll tax specifically. So, because there's fewer jobs that are eligible to be taxed in Seattle today than there were 4 years ago. So their own numbers are showing, hey, we're now going the wrong way. And this strategy of extracting a lot from a small group of employers, I think, is proving short-sighted.
As Washington voters prepare for key statewide races this year, attention is also turning to the state's highest court. Questions about judicial independence, constitutional interpretation, and the appointment process have become increasingly prominent as several seats on the Washington Supreme Court are on the ballot. In our next conversation, we speak with a candidate for the state's highest court about how judges balance precedent, legislative intent, and the responsibility to uphold the Constitution.
I was looking through some of the candidate questionnaires that you and a few others had, I think, to different Democratic parties. And I saw that you had wrote that the courts have to start with the Constitution, and that if legislation crosses the line, it should be declared unconstitutional. Was wondering how that philosophy shapes your approach to, say, voter approved legislation or legislation enacted by the legislature that pushes constitutional boundaries.
Well, certainly if that comes to the court, there will be arguments on both sides. And some will be saying the Constitution says this, and therefore this is allowed. And some will be saying the Constitution doesn't allow this, and here's the authority for that, and here's the precedent for that. And so I would consider arguments on both sides, look at the Constitution and read it myself and understand that different people can read different meanings into the same words. Obviously, we have a court system for a reason, because if everybody read the same thing the same way every time, we would be out of a job. But where there is a dispute, where there is clear ambiguity, then you look at how it's been interpreted in the past, and then you look at whether there's been a mistake in the past. We have a history of sometimes interpreting things the wrong way, and that's why the Supreme Court is has the mandate, if you will, to overturn past precedent. What's the process and what do you weigh? I have to say that's a case by case analysis. Sometimes it's going to be very obvious because the Constitution says this and the legislation says this. Sometimes the question will be that, well, the Constitution says this broadly. How does this specific term either fit into or not fit into? And I think the analysis is depending on the case and the argument.
Mhm.
So if I'm approaching that decision, I will read, understand, research, not substitute my own judgment for that of the arguments in front of me, but be persuaded by the one that I think is the most in line with the Constitution as written or what is clearly intended. Reasonable minds will disagree on that, and I will give it my best judgment in the time.
And I know you can't say how you would rule on a future case or an issue likely to reach the court. But looking at some high-profile decisions in the past, like the Blake decision, in the Quinn decision in 2023, how should voters understand how you would consider cases where president, constitutional text, public safety, and tax policy, all this legislative intent collides?
You know that's 16 questions in one, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, where legislation collides with precedent, we have precedent that says precedent isn't overturned unless it's wrongly decided and currently harmful. And then there has to be a real live controversy and there has to be someone withstanding. So just because there's a law that may in fact be constitutional on the books, it doesn't come before the Supreme Court until or unless there is a case and a litigant that challenges that. So it's not like any Supreme Court justice just gets to clean house and say, da, 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 da. The cases have to be brought by people who've been harmed by them or have standing. And then that comes to the court. What does the court do in evaluating precedent? I guess we have our own precedent about when that is appropriate or not. Not to not answer your question, but to say that the process, I think, is the same no matter what the issue is. And if it's, again, legislation based or whether it's a case that interpreted legislation, again, if it was wrongly decided and it's currently harmful, the Supreme Court has the duty to fix those decisions. And sometimes that happens decades later. Sometimes, probably more rarely, it can be a faster turnaround to adjust something that was wrong to begin with. But in any human system, human error is made, and the beauty of our system is that we have a mechanism for fixing that. But that mechanism shouldn't be like a whipsaw where you're just going back and forth every change in administration, every election. Now we have
Mhm.
different precedent. Now we have different laws, different decisions. I think the predictability, consistency, and stability of the court system and judicial decisions is important so that litigants and attorneys know what to predict under similar
Mhm.
circumstances and get the same kind of ruling under the same kinds of facts. So no two cases are identical. You should have some reasonable expectation of the range of outcomes in order just to function as a society of laws.
And are there parts of the Supreme Court's reasoning in either the Blake or Quinn cases where you think voters should pay closer attention to when assessing candidates ahead of August?
That is an area I'm going to decline to
Hmm.
comment on because Quinn, of course, had to do with the capital gains tax. Now we have perhaps similar, perhaps not so similar income tax legislation coming on. So if I were even to point the public to this, it would
Hmm.
indicate, hey, I disagree with the majority. I agree with I can't put myself in that box because I need to maintain neutrality so I can hear all arguments without having predetermined which ones I like. I'm
Can
sorry.
you no, can you explain that judicial rule for voters? Because it might
Mm.
be a surprise to most people to read, like, hey, the income tax is front and center this year, but they can't even talk about it. Can you
Nobody
explain that
can.
rule and then also the limits that you guys have in soliciting donations? Because I know you guys can't personally solicit funding as well.
Yeah. So the code of judicial ethics is what governs judges and candidates for judicial positions. And it restrains us from, let's start with the donations, soliciting personally any donations. I
Hmm.
can't ask people for money. And I think the idea is well, we shouldn't be buying our justice, right? There shouldn't
Hmm.
be the appearance that because I contributed to this campaign, therefore this judicial officer owes me something or is likely to make a decision that favors me or my business or my group interests, whatever they are, because they asked me for money and I gave it to them. I looked them in the eye and I know exactly what our understanding was.
Hmm.
Okay, so that does tie our hands a little bit because in trying to do fundraising for a campaign, a third party has to make the pitch and has to make the ask. And obviously, the public disclosure requirements show who gives any amount unless it's under $100. So there's full disclosure about who's supporting which candidate. That's a restriction on us. The other restrictions that we cannot promise or comment on issues or possible cases that may come before us. And I think that's also important because if I said, gee, I don't want to pay any more income taxes in the state, I don't want to pay any more taxes in the state of Washington,
Hmm.
I don't want another tax, and I go into a case with have that comment out there in the public, then people are going to think when I make a decision that's in favor of that outcome, oh, well, she's pre-decided it and we knew it and that's why we voted for her. That actually creates a partisan judiciary. And if this is a nonpartisan race and we want the judiciary to remain nonpartisan so that it can be the checks and balances for the two partisan branches of government, the legislative and the executive, well, then we've lost the the point of these separation of powers and the checks and balances because then it's just one party controlling everything. So that's why it's important not to comment on things that could come
Hmm.
before the court. And to your point, any case that you bring up in theory could come before the court in a 2-year term or in a 6-year term
Hmm.
because there could be a case that arises and works its way up. And if the Supreme Court has authority to overturn any prior decision, it pretty much means that anything that's commented on
Hmm.
could create again that appearance of conflict or the appearance of prejudging an issue and therefore having a closed mind when the case actually comes before the court. Thanks for asking that. It is really hard to say, okay,
Hmm.
look, vote for me. I can't promise you anything. I can't ask you for money. I can't do anything but say, well, then why are we running? Well, you run on experience, you run on character, you run on the person you trust most to make the decisions in the moment, to do the work, and to do so without owing anybody any favors or even appearing to have a conflict of interest.
Do you
That's
think,
what I'm emphasizing in my
uh,
campaign anyway.
sorry to interrupt you there. Do you think the state Supreme Court, as it is right now, or the situation it's heading, do you think we already have a partisan judiciary, or is the way recent appointments have been made, do you think that raises potential concerns or flags around a partisan judiciary?
Where I think some partisanship comes into play is just by the nature of the constitutional authority given to a partisan elected governor to appoint justices for a term when a prior justice retires. What happens and has happened in this election is two of our justices have retired before the end of their term, which gives Governor Ferguson, gave Governor Inslee, gave Governor Gregoire, any governor has the opportunity to appoint their replacement. Well, then that replacement, you might say, has a little bit of a leg up in the next election, even if they have to run, because now they're the incumbent. And to the average citizen, the incumbent somehow already earned the job, is maybe doing an okay job, or they don't have a reason to complain because they don't feel the effects of those decisions. And often incumbents don't get opposed in elections. They're just on the ballot. And so that becomes a way where a partisan governor, not to use the term stack the court, but can stack the court, can essentially handpick those justices who then still have to run for election. And that's what's going on in my race. There is an incumbent who's been on the bench for 5 months, appointed by the governor. I want to give the voters of Washington a choice. We don't know what went into the governor's analysis about why he picked this person. So the voters should determine the best candidate to be their own elected justice in the Supreme Court. If you look at the current state of the court, 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices started their terms by appointment, all from democratically well, Democrat, partisan
Mhm.
Democrat, by Democratic governors as opposed to Republican governors. They were all democratically elected, but they were part of one party versus another. Does that mean that they are leaning in a partisan direction? I think the fact that five open seats in this election are getting so much attention and press is that at least some voters in Washington think so. I personally know that any judicial officer I've encountered on any level of any court is mostly there for the right reasons, doing their best and doing the right thing. But as you can see in a society, we have a broad spectrum of perception about what the right thing is, the right way to go about it, the policies that are implemented, and the like. And so that's the long answer to that partisan question. I don't think it's non-existent, but
Mhm.
I'm not going to slap an overarching label on any individual justice because I know that well-meaning people still can disagree on how decisions are made.
So the two recent appointees, one your opponent Justice Colleen Medley, and then Theo Angelis in position five. Theo worked with Governor Ferguson at K&L Gates, and Melody had worked under Ferguson when he was the Attorney General. Some might argue that, look, they have valuable experience. That's something that you would want in a position like this. But at the same time, it's very close. Do you think that it's getting too close for comfort in terms of those appointments, or how should voters assess that situation?
In my opinion, if I were in the shoes of Justice Melody and I had worked closely with the now governor and the governor signed legislation that's now before me, I would not be comfortable trying to evaluate that case because of the appearance of a conflict of interest. I would recuse myself. I can't imagine my own former boss. I worked with Michael Buney at Michael Buney and Associates at the first 17 years of my practice. If he had a case that came before me in the Supreme Court, I would recuse myself in a heartbeat because there's just a relationship at the water cooler or informally or something that goes beyond even the work bounds. I question, if you will, it's a dangerous thing to say. I question a governor who would think these appointees are great picks if he has worked closely with them and knows that there is at least the appearance of a conflict of interest if, again, legislation that he signs come before them. Surely there are any number of qualified judges and attorneys in Washington state that he has not worked closely with, that he could have chosen that didn't have that close personal connection. So there's something there that I
Mhm.
think is worth questioning as to loyalty. We are not a society where loyalty trumps all. It should be experience, impartiality, and what voice do you bring? What perspective do you bring to the Supreme Court, as opposed to what loyalties have you built up in your career?
Finally, tonight, Washington drivers could feel the impact of some of the highest gas prices in the nation. While global oil markets remain volatile amid ongoing uncertainty in the Middle East, analysts say Washington's fuel costs are also shaped by state taxes, environmental policies, and refining challenges across the West Coast. We spoke with GasBuddy petroleum analyst Patrick De Haan about what consumers should watch for in the coming weeks and whether relief at the pump could be on the horizon. Here with me today is Patrick De Haan with GasBuddy, here to talk about the new deal from the Trump administration that could potentially end the war in Iran that has caused gas prices to go up across the country. Here in Washington State, the average price is right around $5.50 a gallon, while much of that is attributed to state and local taxes. Patrick De Haan, big picture, what does this tentative deal mean for the potential reopening of the strait and gas prices here in Washington State?
Well, in Washington and much of the country, it's very much a do or die situation. We're starting to see some rather ominous figures. The SPR, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, has declined to its lowest level since 1983. The delivery point for crude oil in the United States, the inventories have declined to their lowest level since 2014. Oil inventories in OECD countries has fallen to their lowest level since 1990. So this is very much a do or die situation to reopen the strait. If it does happen, it will mean potentially lower gasoline prices over the duration of the coming months rather quickly. We've already seen gas prices in Washington falling 23 cents in the last month on the hopes that a deal could happen. If this deal does move forward, it could mean more falling prices. But if it doesn't happen, which is a distinct possibility, it could mean gasoline prices eventually slingshot up even more significantly than they did in the last few months. So, very much an extreme amount of uncertainty over what's going to happen. But if the deal does happen and the strait does reopen and it's verifiable, it certainly would usher in lower gasoline and diesel prices for much of the rest of the year.
Can you kind of briefly explain where this deal is at right now? I know a lot of people might not know all the political jargon and context that goes around it, but for consumers at the pump, is this a concrete thing? Is it more of tell me where it's at?
Well, we've been back and forth. The president surfaced the idea of a deal. He announced the deal on Sunday, but we've seen in the past few months these deals may unravel, ceasefires may be violated. There are other elements that have continued this war for now 107 days, or the strait has been closed for 107 days. That's where things stand now. There's probably a lot of pressure the administration is under to get the strait reopened. Iran has certainly been leveraging that negotiation tactic by keeping the strait closed. And in the backdrop of this, global oil supplies have been dropping as a result. Now, oil markets have been anticipating that a deal would be imminent here for the last couple of weeks, and that's what has pushed oil down. Is the possibility has gone up of a deal. The president's been teasing it for weeks, but there's still the possibility that something could happen late in this that could unravel a potential deal. So gas prices have been hanging on a thread to any developments, whether good or bad. And that is holding true now more than ever. Global oil inventories aren't looking very good. And if a deal doesn't happen, we're suddenly going to be greeted with the reality that global oil supplies are in a very precarious position.
If the deal does hold, how quickly could Washington state consumers see some relief at the pump? And at the same time, what would that price look like compared to the national average, assuming both fall with a deal going through?
Well, we've already seen oil prices declining even with the strait remaining closed based on this deal happening, and that's already impacting gas prices and pulling them down. So if the deal finally, gets through, it's just going to solidify more continued decreases that have already started. If the deal doesn't happen, it probably will mean the opposite. And it could mean a continued decline for as long as oil prices go down. But we don't have a whole lot of clarity on exactly what will happen. So it's impossible to know if this is going to pave the way for lower prices for the rest of the year, or whether there's going to be new turns and twists in the road down the road.
So right now there's about $1.45 gap between the national average and the Washington state average. For Washington drivers, how much of that price is really tied to the global market versus state-specific costs like state taxes, the cap and trade climate program, and stuff like that?
Well, price in Washington about $1.10 a gallon more than they were a year ago. Beyond that, most of that is probably attributed. The difference that is beyond that $1.10 is attributed to Washington's programs like cap and invest, gasoline taxes. Washington now only trails California, which has even more environmental programs. So, much of the reason why Washington, 5.49 a gallon today. Much of the reason why prices are over $5 have to do with Washington's higher gas taxes, its cap and invest program. But some of the higher costs is also attributed to states like California, which have essentially overregulated and pushed refineries to leave the state. And that is something that's impacted really the entirety of the West Coast. So you really can't underscore that Washington, a significant reason for Washington's elevated gas prices have to do with state-specific taxes and state-specific programs like cap and invest.
Uh, in the next 2 or so weeks, the state gas tax itself is set to increase by 2%, and it's going to continue in the years ahead. Doesn't seem like a major jump, but in terms of the state already having high gas prices compared to the rest of the country, how noticeable are little hikes like that to the average consumer?
Well, in and of themselves, they're not very noticeable. But over time, the total impact that these taxes have grows more and more significantly. Washington is already, as you mentioned, at a significant premium to the national average. Increases in gas taxes will further elevate the gap between the national average and Washington state in years ahead. So while the 2 cents may not be felt, the fact that Washington's average is $1.50 a gallon above the national average and growing is going to be a point of contention that continues in the years ahead.
I'm looking at the map behind you. It clearly shows Washington State bright red there with Oregon and California. If pressure does ease in the U.S.-Iranian conflict, um, will the state likely remain among the most expensive in the nation in terms of gas and diesel prices?
Yeah, without a doubt, the map behind me is not necessarily a single day snapshot. It's a snapshot of where things generally lie. The West Coast almost always the most expensive because of refining challenges, because California's unique environmental regulations have kind of forced refineries out of the state, or they've made it counterproductive to operate in the state. And then you have the West. Many states have elevated environmental standards. There is a cost to that, as well as high gasoline taxes. So, the map behind me may be a moment in time, but generally the proportions, when you look at states in the Gulf and states in the West Coast, generally those proportions hold up over time. And it's the exact opposite reasons that areas of the Gulf tend to be cheaper. It's low taxes, it's proximity to infrastructure that drives prices lower in Gulf states.
And to close, what should consumers be looking for in the next few weeks? Is it crude prices, the tanker traffic, refinery capacity? What will give them a sign that prices are likely to fall in the weeks or months ahead?
It's all about the situation between the U.S. and Iran. Will the Strait open? Will it open significantly? Oil prices will tell that story for you. So if you just watch the price of oil, that should be enough to know where we're headed.
That's all for this edition of Washington in Focus Daily. For more reporting and stories like these, visit thecentersquare.com. I'm Tim Klauser, and I'll see you next time.